All right. So let's jump into conversation about the what you guys discussed in your breakout rooms. Who wants to start it off? Go
I
ahead,
could
Vanessa.
start it.
Yeah.
I think out of all the passages we read so far, this one is my favorite
Okay.
because of the strong emotions shared in it, and also the use of imagery. While I was reading it, I got to imagine myself in a situation, even though I cannot connect to it. The writer uses words like you and we,
Mm-hmm.
so like it creates like a connection between the reader and the writer to try and imagine yourself in a position of like dehumanization.
Yeah.
And a part of the text that really stood out to me was it said, "A beginning whose time is marked by these balls and chains gone green." Um, I think the lines between beginning whose time is marked by these balls and chains, it represents that like their time left is determined by their buyers.
Yeah.
Like their identity is no longer in existence.
Mm-hmm.
They lost it already once they boarded the slave ship.
Yeah.
And then gone green, I think that represents that, you know, slaves were never seen as humans. They were never seen. They were seen as like objects of money. And
Right.
that's what I got in the lines of gone green.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
I like that. Um, Anyone else want to share what was discussed in their breakout rooms?
Um, there is this one passage we were slightly confused about, or like I was confused about in particular. It was like towards the end on page 8,
Okay.
and it said, "For through this experience made you original victim floating towards the sea's abyss, an exception." And then yeah, that part just confused me, like when it said original victim.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't really know what that meant.
Well, so essentially, what he's saying is originally it made you victim, right? I mean, it says floating towards the sea's abyss, comma, an exception. So this is gonna let you know that he's about to shift this notion of being originally a victim, right? It became something shared and made us, the descendants, one people among others, right? So really, it's about the the abyss which originally made somebody a victim, shifting to making one people, descendants, right? I'm gonna explain this a little bit more as I go into my notes. But does that kind of give you a little bit more sense of what he's getting at, Ashley?
Yeah, that actually does make
Okay,
sense. Yeah.
cool. Anyone else want to share what was discussed in their breakout room? What about the abyss? Who tackled the abyss question in their breakout room? Give us what you think the abyss means, or even what Glissant is getting us to think about with the abyss. Juan, did your group get to? I'm sorry. Go ahead, Marjorie. Go ahead.
Sorry. So what I thought it meant, it was like, um, the really like when he was in really like difficult situations
Mm-hmm.
where he felt like he was in the dark, like he was having, I don't know, just like in a really difficult situation. That's what I thought it meant. I don't know if I'm right.
Yeah, no, you're right, and I think what you said that is really fecund is the darkness part, right? Um, what makes darkness scary, if you will? What about the darkness that makes it scary?
Um, Honestly, wouldn't know how to answer that. I just you're in a place where I'm guessing where he felt alone, where he couldn't see that light that everybody says is at the end of the tunnel.
Right, you can't see, so let's situate ourselves within that. Vanessa, what do you think? Why is darkness
I
scarier?
think it's about like it's like darkness, so it's unknown.
That's it.
You don't know what's there. Yeah.
That's it. Perfect. So the unknown, right? And when the perfect way to think about this darkness or the abyss, rather, is the unknown, right? And he gives us the shifting of the abyss, which I'll go through in more details in my notes. But think about that abyss as the unknown. And I'm looking at the chat. Gypsy says not being able to see or predict an outcome, which is the perfect articulation of the unknown, right? So you guys are there. Perfect, perfect. So what I want to do before I jump into my notes, kind of piggyback on something that Vanessa said, and I think what she got to the reason why I had us engage this text, right? So as I'm putting the course together, I'm thinking like what this course is in certain ways is an oral genealogy of African experiences, right? And you can't really go through a genealogy of African experiences without going over the enslavement period, right? You really can't do that. But for me, I didn't want to go through that going through the same tropes, right? Like we all were taught about this in school, and there's a certain trope that comes along with dealing with the period of enslavement. And I didn't want to do that. But I wanted you guys to have an effective, with an A, not an E, response to that experience, right? Um, and to Vanessa's point, the descriptive nature of the imagery within Glissant's text, it gives you that effective experience. It's visceral, right? It kind of gets you in the stomach when you read it and deal with the imagery. And I thought that this was a good way to kind of cover this experience without going through the same old humdrum tropes that we always get through our K through 12 educational experience. This is actually one of my favorite theoretical books. The book is entitled Poetics of Relations. The author is Edward Glissant, who is a Martinican poet, intellectual, philosopher from, of course, the island of Martinique. He's trained in France, so he's a French-trained Caribbean intellectual, right? The book was originally published in French, and it was translated into English by Betsy Wang. Or Wings, excuse me. So let's get into the notes, right? It's titled The Open Boat. And he starts off with this like brief paragraph, if you will, stating, for the Africans who lived through the experience of deportation to the Americas, comma, asterisk, right? Confronting the unknown with neither preparation nor challenge was no doubt petrifying. Right? So again, he lets you know, confronting the unknown. So we now know to think of the unknown as the abyss, right? So when I read that first portion, I put the deportation to the Americas, commas, asterisks, right? I don't know how many of you guys paid attention to this when you read it, but you can see there that asterisk. So that asterisk is what's called an endnote. That lets you know to go to the end of the page for more details. And if you look, you see the asterisk. That's relating to the asterisk at the top of the page. So that portion that's going to follow that second asterisk is going to give you more detail as to the first asterisk, right? So on the asterisk at the bottom of the page, it states, the slave trade came through the cramped doorway of the slave ship, leaving a wake like that of a crawling desert caravan. It may be drawn like this, and he gives us this image here. He says, African countries to the east, lands of the Americas to the west. This creature is in the image of a fabril. African language became deterritorialized, thus contributing to the creolization of the West. So African language becoming deterritorialized, right? I'm Ghanaian. I speak Akan. I'm kidnapped, put in the bottom of this boat, and I'm transported to the Americas. So my Akan language has become deterritorialized and now shipped to the Americas. I'm Nigerian. I speak Igbo. I'm kidnapped. I'm put on the bottom of this ship. Now my Igbo African language has become deterritorialized and is transported to the Americas, right? Creating a creolization effect in the Western world, okay? This is the most completely known confrontation. Pay attention. Confrontation is going to become important, right? This is the most completely known confrontation between the powers of the written word and the impulses of orality. So when you hear orality, think about the ability to orate, right? The ability to sing, the ability to speak, the ability to make poems, the ability to beatbox, the ability to rap, right? To cry is orality. So it's a confrontation between the written word and orality. It's a confrontation, right? The only written thing on slave ships was the account book listing the exchange values of the enslaved. Okay, that's the only thing written on the boat. Within the ship's space, the cry of those deported was stifled. What does it mean to be stifled, to have something stifled? What does that mean? What does to stifle mean?
Like, probably, like, it was all over. The cry was, like, all over the ship.
Not quite. Anybody want to help her out? If I'm going to stifle a cry. To mute, suffocate. Yep, it's a good way of putting it, Gypsy. To suffocate, to mute, to limit, right? To stop. So this cry becomes stifled, as it would be in the realm of the plantation. This confrontation still reverberates to this day. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here, but let's deal with these confrontations, right? We know that the first confrontation is between the written word and the cries of those deported. Now, what is the written word? What he said, the only written thing on this ship is what? He said it very clearly. The only written word is what?
The account book.
Right. So the ledgers that shows you the exchange value of those who were purchased, right? Your receipt book, right? So what this written word signifies is the inhumanity of those who are purchased, right? Because once a number figure is placed on you for your value, you have now become a product, right? So this written word insinuates the inhumanity of those who were deported. But it's in confrontation with the cries, right? When a human is injured, what does it do? It cries. When a human is hurt, it yells, right? It orates. So a confrontation's at play between the written signifying your inhumanity and your natural human response to trauma. Okay, that's the first confrontation at play. The confrontation between the written and the oral. Then this confrontation evolves into the confrontation between what's happening in your desire to yell about your pain, right? And then the stifling of that. That's another confrontation that plays. And then he says that confrontation, that particular confrontation, still reverberates to this day, right? What that may look like now is Black Lives Matter. Nah, but all lives matter, right? That's a stifling of a cry that signifies your humanity. And he says that still plays out today. Then he goes into the abyss and he starts to provide us with these three metamorphoses of the abyss. And he says, what is terrifying partakes of the abyss, 3 times linked to the unknown. So again, just thinking about the abyss as the unknown. First, so this is the first metamorphosis, the time you fell into the belly of the boat. For in your poetic vision, a boat has no belly. A boat does not swallow up, does not devour. A boat is steered by the open skies. Yet, the belly of this boat dissolves you, participates you into a non-world from which you cry out. Again, that cry, right? This boat is a womb abyss, right? So the first stage of the abyss is the boat, which he calls the womb abyss, okay? Going to the next paragraph, he gives us the second stage of the abyss. The next abyss was the depths of the sea. Whenever a fleet of ships gave chase to a slave ship, it was easiest just to lighten the boat by throwing cargo overboard, weighing it down with balls and chains. What is the cargo that's being thrown overboard?
Bodies.
Right. The bodies of the enslaved, right? And they weigh these bodies down with balls and chains to ensure that they can't swim or they won't float, right? And he says, these underwater signposts mark the course between the Gold Coast to the Leeward Islands. Now, the Gold Coast is the west coast of Africa, right? The Leeward Islands are the islands of the Atlantic, of the Western Pacific, right? The Atlantic. Correct. That's correct. Originally correct. So, what are underwater signposts? What is that metaphor to get you to think about? Think about a freeway. I think that's a good way to kind of situate his metaphor. So you traveling on the 10 West, right? You got Adams, you got Crenshaw, you got La Brea, you got, I think Fairfax is next, right? These are signs that let you know where your exits are, right? Glissant is saying these bodies that they throw overboard that are tied to ball and chains to make sure that they sink all the way to the bottom can literally give you directions on how to navigate from the west coast of Africa all the way to the Western Hemisphere. There's literally signs, light posts, if you will, to give you your direction, right? So that's the second abyss. The third abyss is all that we leave behind from our home, right? He says, all that has been left behind, not to be regained for generations. So your generations to come won't be able to access what is left behind, right? So I'm a descendant of African ancestry. I cannot go back and access what my ancestors were forced to leave behind. I can't trace that back. I don't even know who my ancestors are and which area they come from to go back and trace it back, right? So he's saying that's the third abyss, all that gets left behind when you make that passage. Feeling a language vanish. The words of the gods vanish. And the sealed image of even the most everyday object vanish. That's that third abyss, right? All that you know to be normal, to be familiar, gone. He says the populations that then formed, despite having forgotten the chasm, despite being able to imagine the passion of those who foundered there, nonetheless wove this sail. They did not use it for return to the former land, but rose up on this unexpected, dumbfounded land. Okay? So what becomes important for me in this passage, one, is that the population then formed, right? So again, this idea of newness is produced, right? So new population is formed. Think about it. Think about what he's articulating. African people are being kidnapped all throughout the Gold Coast, right? So again, as I gave you the example of someone from Ghana speaking Akan, somebody from Nigeria speaking Igbo, somebody from Senegal speaking Twi, right? These are various African languages. They all get snatched up and they get put on the boat, right? You can't speak to the person on the boat because they speak a different language than you, even though they're chained next to you. You're trying to figure out what the fuck is going on. How did we end up here? You chained to me, I'm chained to you. You're trying to communicate with them, but they're speaking different languages, right? He says, this experience, it produced a new population, who we may call African Americans, who you may call Jamaicans, who you may call people from Trinidad and Tobago, who you may call people from Panama, right? People from Honduras, people from the Dominican Republic, right? These are the new population that gets formed through this experience. And they said they nonetheless wove a sail, right? But they didn't use this sail to go back home to Africa. They used that sail. Think about what a sail does for a boat. What does a sail do for a boat? It's the boat's engine, right? The wind catches the sail, and that's how the boat navigates. So he's saying they didn't use this engine to go back home to Africa. They used it to produce newness here on the Americas, right? And then he kind of, for me, he articulates what the sail is. It's knowledge, right? And then he says, not just a specific knowledge, appetite, suffering, and delight of one particular people. Not only that, but knowledge of the whole. So it's not knowledge of just me being from Ghana and being a Khan, right? It's a knowledge of, damn, okay, I'm from Ghana, you from Nigeria, you from Senegal. Okay, okay. Let's think about this as a whole. How can we produce a knowledge as of this whole group, right? As the knowledge of the whole, greater from having been at the abyss and freeing knowledge of relation within the whole. So now I'm not focusing on the knowledge that I have as an individual Lacan, right? Now it's about the knowledge that the abyss produces. I'm Lacan, you Igbo. We both here in this situation, this abyss together. What understandings are being produced by our situation, right? It's a knowledge that we don't trust the person who put us here. You know, that's a knowledge that our similar understanding produces, right? So this is what he becomes concerned with. This is this notion of relations, the knowledge of the whole, right? He says, for this experience made you, this is the question that I believe Ashlyn had, right? For though this experience made you original victim, right? So originally you're a victim because of this abyss, floating towards the sea's abyss, an exception. It becomes something shared and made us, right? The descendants of our African ancestors, one people among others. People do not live on exception. Relation is not made up of things that are foreign, but of shared knowledge. This experience of the abyss can now be said to be the best element of exchange. So this abyss is where we'll find that shared knowledge, right? It's not about things that are foreign. It's not about you speak this language, I speak the other language. That's not what we're going to focus on. We're not going to focus on that you're Muslim and I'm Christian. It's not the focus. We're going to focus on things that we have in common. And we know that this abyss, we have that in common. This is where we're going to build our knowledge on. And he says, this is why we stay with poetry, right? Poetry gives you the ability to manipulate language, to play with words and make words into imagery, right? And this becomes generative for the new production that Glissant is concerned with. That's why we stay with poetry, because poetry can do things with words that your standard essay can't do, right? If you think about last week's reading in Ngugi, talking about his tension that he found between his native language, Kikuyu, and the English language, poetry allows you to find some peace within that contradiction. If you think about the week before that, Somé talking about anytime something's translated from one culture to another, an element of violence ensues. Poetry allows you to undermine and circumvent that violence because you can manipulate language to make it articulate things that English may not have words for. This is why we stay with poetry. So I'm going to end my notes there. We'll transition into our fishbowl. Know with the fishbowl, if you went twice already, you're good for the semester. You have to go twice. You have one time to pass. You could talk about your journal. You could talk about what was discussed in the breakout rooms. You could talk about what was discussed in my notes. Does anybody want to volunteer? Okay, Vanessa, got you. Gypsy, got you. Well, let's get one more. Give me 1 second, Faith. I got you. I know Gypsy, you raised your hand too, right? Yep. Okay. Faith, to address your question. Yes, these are recorded and they will be posted on the Google Classroom site, not Canvas, on Google Classroom site under recorded lectures or course lectures, I believe. Let's get one more for the fishbowl. Juan, are you prepared to fishbowl today?
I've already completed both of my fishbowls, sir.
Thank you, Juan.
Thank you.
Marjorie, are you prepared to fishbowl today?
Do I have a pass? I don't know.
Let me see. No, you don't. You used your pass on the 13th.
All right,
Yeah, so
I'll
you
do it.
pack the fishbowl. Okay. All right, so we have Vanessa, Gypsy, and Marjorie for our fishbowl. Whoever wants to start it off, it's on you.
So on page 7, like the professor brought up, it talked about like feeling of language vanish, the word of God's vanish, and etc. To me, that really represented that those enslaved really lost their self of identity, and I think that's when, like, I think like self identity can go beyond the passage too. Like, it can play a role in today's world as well. Things happen to us, and then like we tend to lose our identity based on what has happened to us or what we experience. And it happened just like those that got enslaved. They got enslaved, and they everything that they were, it was gone.
Yeah.
All right, so I'll go next. I wanted to bring up the paragraph or a sentence from page 6. Although you are alone in this suffering, you share in the unknown with others whom you have yet to know.
Mhm.
And I found this like very interesting because of the way that the author was able to use the abyss to connect everything to the unknown, without having to know the outcome. And like was like what was mentioned earlier, how they were picked in different places and everyone spoke different languages. The abyss was already a tough place to be, not being able to see or like predict an outcome, and then not being able to communicate with others whom you like share this suffering, but yet you feel alone.
Right.
Like you weren't able to communicate with each other since they were like picked from different places. So yeah, like the I really like the way that the author um will use the abyss and this passage to connect them.
Yeah.
I was gonna say kind of the same thing as Gypsy. Um, there's like this small sentence where he said the next abyss was the depths of the sea, and it just like shows how alone and how difficult it was for the people who went through this suffering. Um, yeah, that was about it.
Cool. All right. Thank you guys for those who fishbowl. We'll transition to overall class conversation. So anyone can jump in at this point. But one thing I do want to provide, just to kind of help you guys understand what Glissant's up to a little bit more. This idea or this notion of creolization, right? And in the book, he has a whole chapter dedicated to creolization. Is anybody on here familiar with Creole culture? Familiar with the Caribbean? Familiar with Louisiana or anything like that? Or been down to Louisiana? No. Anybody familiar with the dish called gumbo? Anybody heard of gumbo before? Okay. So when you think about gumbo, it's a perfect metaphor for what glissant is talking about, right? And so when you make gumbo, you can think of it like as a soup or a stew, right? And what becomes fundamental in gumbo is the broth or the roux. And it could be like veggie. I would personally probably use veggie broth, but you could use beef broth, whatever, seafood broth, whatever you so choose, right? But you pour the broth in the pot, then you'll pour in your seasonings. And you're going to let the seasoning sit maybe 15, 20 minutes. So that way the flavors from those seasonings infuse into the broth, right? So that produces its own flavor unto itself. You'll make rice, pour rice in the broth. Sausage, you'll pour that in the broth. Chicken, if you're into chicken, you'll pour that in the broth. Crab legs, shrimp, other type of fish that you may be into, oysters, whatever the case may be, you dump all that in there. Okra goes in there. And you let this sit for about 45 minutes to an hour, right? And the simmering, the time simmering, allows all the different elements to infuse to produce one unique taste, right? And if you think about what Glissant is describing, what he's articulating, it's really the same process, right? You have various Africans coming from various parts of West Africa, some parts of Central Africa, some parts of Southern Africa speaking different dialects, right? So on this passage, they're trying to communicate, they're trying to survive, they're trying to figure this shit out, right? So they're talking to each other. And through their conversations with each other, although they're speaking different languages, they produce a different language, right? So all these different seasonings sitting in this broth produce its own flavor, right? Then they get off the boat with the flavor that they produce with their own broken language that they concocted to communicate with one another, and they're dropped off in the Americas. So now the overseer speaks English, right? So you're gonna pour that into the pot. So now the language that they created to communicate with each other is now being infused with English. And now you get the production of this language that you call Ebonics, that would eventually evolve to what we now call the African American Vernacular English, right? Some of these people on this boat was dropped off in the Caribbean. And where they're dropped off, the part of the Caribbean, they speak French. So you have the flavors that come together in the broth that produce the language of all these Africans coming together trying to communicate with one another. And that's being mixed with the French language. And that produces language like Creole that you hear spoken in parts of Haiti, that you may hear in New Orleans, right? Some are dropped off in the Caribbean, but the owners of that particular Caribbean island speak British or speak English because they're British, right? So they take their broken language that they got from being on the bottom of the ship. It's infused with this British version of English, and they produce the patois that the Jamaicans speak, right? So this is how this notion or this idea of gumbo, bringing a whole bunch of different things together to produce one new thing, it symbolizes what Glissant is talking about in this experience of the open boat, right? All these different cultures come together to produce something new, right? Think about America. You have African and indigenous people here creating culture, right? The Europeans and the Spanish come over and conquer and infuse by force, but infuse their culture into it. And now we have this melting pot country we call America, right? No different. It's gumbo. And so what Glissant is trying to get us to think about is, yeah, it's fucked up what happened. It's fucked up how this country came together, right? There's no arguing that. But what happened is something new was produced. A new culture ensued through this merging of different cultures and different ways of being. This is this notion of relation. How can we as a people come together and produce something new? This is not only Glissant's project, it's the project of a lot of Caribbean thinkers, from Frantz Fanon, who Glissant studied, from Aimé Césaire, who taught Frantz Fanon, right? Is this notion, this idea of producing the new human. We take it to a more contemporary analysis. Stuart Hall, a Jamaican-born individual who goes to the UK and does intellectual work, he gets concerned with this project of producing the new human. So it becomes part of the Black radical intellectual tradition is to produce newness, right? And relations is about the production of the new. So hopefully that helps you guys understand a little bit more what Glissant's thesis was. It's really about how do you take people coming together and being attentive of how people come together and produce new realities. So with the last 10 minutes, I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts, the rest of the class who did not fishbowl, and those who did fishbowl. If you want to cover some other things, we could do that too. But let's open it up to a broader class conversation.
One thing that I really liked from the author was how he would use we and you a lot to kind of like emphasize that sense of unity that he was trying to talk about throughout the whole passage.
You know, Ashley, that's a very good call out. And I didn't get to do this last class, but I'm glad you brought it up because it makes me think about it. It's this notion of meta theory, okay? And bear with me. It's like, but you'll get it. Just rock with me for a second. So meta theory is having what you're writing about, your subject matter, in this case, the experiences of African people going through enslavement, right? And having that play out through the way that you're writing. So Ashlyn is saying he's using this notion of we and you. So that way, you as a reader, you're incorporated into what's happening with the subject matter, right? He, by the way that he writes this, he puts you into the belly of this ship, right? Because the we, like Vanessa said to start the class off, it pulls you in, right? What did I say the thesis of this is about? It's about relation. It's about bringing things together. So that's why I say this is meta theory. He's working out what he wants to talk about with you as a reader. So you as a reader are doing what he's articulating through the pages of his text. And this becomes generative for you as intellectuals, not only as readers, but as writers, right? When you write, how you're writing should be reflected in what you're writing. Does that make sense? Does anyone need me to articulate that or to restate that in a different way? Because this is a really important intellectual practice. And when you get higher up in your academic journey, grad schools, etc., that's going to become really important. So I really want you guys to get this understanding of this notion we call meta theory. So is everybody okay with that? All right, bet. Other thoughts on the reading? Kevin, what do you think about the reading?
It was pretty intriguing.
What else?
I don't know. I just like how I portrayed the fear of the unknown.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. The way that. Also, did anybody pay attention to how the abyss or the unknown, the shift that takes place with the abyss? Did anybody pick up on that? Because in the beginning of the reading, the abyss is depicted in one way, and then towards the end of the reading, the abyss does something totally different. Did anybody catch that? What's the what's the shift, Vanessa?
Like in the beginning, like it just says like it's unknown, it's dark, it's darkness, and then towards the end, I interpreted it as like forgiveness and honoring it. That's the way I interpreted it.
Yeah, I mean you're around there, right? So in the beginning, it's depicted as darkness, it's depicted as unknown, it's depicted as something that's negative, right? But by the end of the essay, he's using the abyss as something that's positive, right? That's what we're going to focus on that brings us together. We're not going to focus on our things that are foreign. We're going to focus on things that are similar, i.e. the abyss, right? So the abyss starts off being the sole negative force that causes this negative experience to be evolving into something that is the sole force that brings all of us together. The metamorphosis of the abyss. So the abyss itself is doing work within the text. Any other questions, comments, concerns, thoughts?
Sir, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry, my internet's acting up, but I did want to mention that it was interesting to me that in the beginning of the story, the abyss was pictured more of as an object. So, for example, like the boat or maybe the ocean. And towards the middle, I felt like it was becoming more of a feeling within the people or the slaves. And then towards the end, it was more of an appreciation.
Yeah. You're absolutely correct, Juan. The only thing I would amend, you were correct at first, towards the people, right? Because slave is not a person. That's an experience that someone go through. So it's very clear that, very important that we're very clear about our terminology. These were only people who were brought into the experience of enslavement. There was no slaves taken from the continent of Africa, right? There were doctors, there were lawyers, there were engineers, there were inventors, there were fathers, there were mothers, there were sons, there were daughters, right? These were people who were placed into the experience of enslavement. But you're absolutely correct. The evolution of the abyss from an actual thing, something material, to a feeling of hopelessness, despair, and unknown, to the opportunity of producing the new. That's a great, great, great articulation of the abyss. I know, Faith, you were having issues with your internet connection. Are you at a space where you could kind of chime in on the conversation? If not, you could just put it in the chat, and that's cool. Let's do this real quick. Okay. What I do want to point out is our reading, for next week. So we're wrapping up our section on relations. Today was the last reading on that, and we're moving into weeks 8 through 11. So we're moving really quickly. So next week we're going to read Zornel Hurston's Of Mules and Men. It's not as dense as this reading, but the difficulty is going to be in the terminology and the language, right? But I think it's the way that it's structured. It helps because if you think about this reading, the Glissant reading as it pertains to language, and me saying how you have various African languages coming together, forming a means of communication, and then being influenced with English to produce a whole nother language, what you're going to read is that production, right? And if you look at the opening paragraph here, y'all been telling and lying about all these vermins, but you ain't never spoke about the highest chief boss of all the world, which is the lion. Sack Daddy commented. So the brokenness of the English that you will read is a direct result of that creolization that Glissant is talking about this week. So I think the only difficulty that you have in next week's reading is that phrasing and is that terminology. I suggest that you read it out loud. It will be helpful because that, going back to this notion of morality, if you hear what she's saying, it will make sense. It's going to be very hard to try to say these things in your head. Read these things in your head and not hear what's being said to get an understanding. So I definitely suggest that you read it out loud. It's not a lot, only 7 pages, but again, that linguistic terminology may cause it to be a little difficult. Is there any last minute comments,